1917 is the bleakest year in the war for the French. They've undergone the slaughter of Verdun. It's the war of the trenches is endless and bloody. Morale is bad. Soldiers are deserting. What would arouse perhaps the patriotism of the French people but a trial and an execution? And apparently she is charged with accepting money from the German consul in The Hague. And she is found guilty. The trial takes place on the 24th of July, 1917. The charge, spying for Germany and causing the death of thousands of French soldiers. Verdict, guilty. Death by firing squad. And she was executed on the 15th of October of 1917. The body was sent to, I think, the Museum of Anatomy in Paris, was dissected, the head was severed, and was on display for a number of years. Why did they do it? Well, in part, it was, I guess, to revive the flagging patriotism of the French. This was a loose woman, a free spirit, and that was also a statement against that. The remains have been missing since 1954. Now, what is very interesting is that the accusations were very ephemeral. She's become a byword for, a woman of mystery, a spy, and so on. But her last words before the execution were, harlot, yes. Spy, never. Those were her final words. Okay, now, I want to draw a comparison. Similar situation, World War II. Many of you are familiar with the famous couturier Coco Chanel. How many of you knew she was a German spy? Okay, a couple do. Apparently, she lived through the war with a German intelligence officer named Baron Dinklage. He worked for the Abwehr, that was German military intelligence. I might say to you that there were a large number of anti-Nazis who were members of the Abwehr, many of them from the old aristocracy, which had never accepted Hitler, and they were in fact those that were involved in the plot against Hitler in 1944. Anyhow, they had her do various jobs for them. She had a nephew who was in a prisoner of war camp, and in return they gave him his freedom. She used her Nazi connections to gain control of her company. The Wertheimer family owned 2/3 of her company, and when the Germans passed their anti-Jewish laws, she took advantage of them to secure full control of the company. She was also known for her fierce anti-Semitism. Detained after the war. Well, there were a number of prominent Frenchmen who were detained, including Maurice Chevalier and so on. But she had actually, there's not much doubt, that she had spied for the Germans, for the Abwehr. However, suddenly out of the blue, Winston Churchill requests that she be freed. No trial, no nothing, go back to work. Well, why would Winston Churchill do that? Apparently, if she had been forced to stand trial for collaboration with the Germans, she might have exposed the Nazi connections of some highly placed English figures, notably the Duke of Windsor and his wife. As you know, perhaps, the Duke of Windsor and his wife, they were going to be put on the throne by the Germans. They had connections with Goring, for example, had been a guest of Hitler's. That's why the royal family shunted them off to Bermuda for World War II. She had been a famous couturier. She had dressed the Duchess of Windsor. She knew them well. She might have spilled the beans. So as a result, she got off scot-free, unlike poor Mata Hari, who, they asked the famous Stasi chief, Marcus Wolf. He was the head of intelligence in East Germany. They asked him what he thought of Mata Hari. And he said, she was an awful spy. I would not have kept her on my payroll, although she did perform a few useful services. So, 1917, have two cases of espionage, electronic and human. And I'm going mostly now to talk about the human, because I think it's more interesting than the codes and so on. And a lot of this is going to take place during World War II, which was really that. Do you know, the British actually put out a book. I guess I didn't bring it. This is the book on Chanel. It's called Sleeping with the Enemy, Coco Chanel, Nazi Agent. But the British actually put out a book called, I didn't bring it with me, How to Be a Spy. Instructions on how to assume a new identity, how to fool your interlocutors, how to use secret messages, and so on. So spying was seen to be as a really adventurous way of life. You could put it that way. And even in the Boy Scout handbook, Baden-Powell, who was the founder of the Boy Scouts, put out a handbook. And he said, volunteer to be a spy. It's a wonderful way to live. So adventurous. It'll set the blood stirring. Well, actually, most spies, there are different motivations. And that's what I'm going to be talking about. I'm grouping these interesting cases under motivation. Number one, overwhelming motivation. What do you think that was?
Patriotism.
Money. The overwhelming was money. And I'm going to talk about several spies, notable spies, who in fact did it for the money, including, and you probably aren't aware of this one, Nasser's son-in-law, who was an Israeli spy for 25 years and collected $3 million over that span from the Mossad. Warned them about the Yom Kippur War. They didn't pay attention. That's the best one of all. Let me say a few more about the spies who did it for money. Going back again to World War II, I might mention this, an American chemist at DuPont. He passed various information to Russian agents, and this is what he wrote afterwards. Democrats, Republicans, fascists, communists, they're all the same to me. I meet you, talking to the agent, because I need cash. I need to build a house, educate my daughter, dress her nicely, and make sure she marries well. That was the motivation. Even the most prominent spy ring that betrayed the CIA, that was the Ames. Ames was his name, right? Aldrich Ames. So he betrayed every American, every Soviet contact in Russia to the NKVD or the KGB. He did it because he needed the money. He was divorced. He wanted to remarry. She was a spendthrift, and so every American contact in the Soviet Union was rounded up and killed. This is what Woolsey said of him in 1994. He did it because this warped, murdering traitor wanted a bigger house than a Jaguar. Sums it up pretty well. Let me mention a few of the spies who spied for money. Cicero. Do you know Cicero at all? Yes. You've heard of Cicero?
Yeah.
The famous movie was made. Cicero, I'll give you the brief background. Cicero was a South Slav, came from, I think, Montenegro, Muslim also. Never achieved much in life, lived in Turkey, drove the equivalent of a cab, hung around bars, nothing. The English ambassador in Istanbul was a kind of old Etonian, sort of a Captain Blimp type. And he hired him as a chauffeur. He needed a chauffeur. The last one had been found prying into things he shouldn't pry into. So they hired him. 1938, and 1943, excuse me. His name was Elysia Basna. The Turkish intelligence warned the ambassador, don't hire this guy. It's not safe. Oh, well, he seemed like a nice enough chap, so he hired him. He's a drifter. He'd worked as a chauffeur, served a sentence in a French prison once where he learned to pick locks. That was important. Now, every afternoon, the ambassador, after lunch, liked to play the piano. And he left his strongbox really out in plain sight. And in the strongbox were all of the messages that would come through from London. So apparently, Basna had learned to pick locks in jail. And he apparently took an impression of the key. And thereafter, he had access to the strongbox. And he found out all kinds of interesting things. As he said, I was a person of no consequence. Why not set up as a spy? So, found all kinds of classified information, and he went to the German embassy in Istanbul and said, I'd like to pass some information to you. I'm a spy. Well, the Germans weren't impressed with him. They said he looked like a clown to them, but nevertheless, they were willing to receive anything he chose to give them, and they paid him for it. One day, the minutes of the Tehran meeting between Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin come across the ambassador's desk. What did they talk about? They talked about the coming invasion of Europe, Overlord, through the French Channel. Oh, well, this was big news, super secret. So he immediately picked up this information and ran to the Germans with it. It meant that in 1943, the Germans knew what was coming in 44. Except that the Germans could not believe that anyone would have been so careless as the ambassador. Didn't believe it. They decided this was absolutely not going to happen. No one could be that careless. So they paid him for it, but never transmitted it. In 44, American intelligence informed the British that there was a mole in the embassy in Istanbul. They began investigating. The ambassador was called home. Basna, Cicero was his code name, had made a ton of money. He decided time to retire and start spending the money. The Germans couldn't believe the stupidity of the ambassador, so they threw away the plans. The British were embarrassed about the whole thing. They retired the ambassador. He was a friend of Anthony from Eton, so they didn't take any action. And Cicero was set to live on the high side, except that the Germans had paid him with counterfeit money. So you probably have seen the movie. It's a good movie, okay? But you forgot. Okay, Germans couldn't believe. Here they had the plan for the invasion. Okay, well, he did it for money, and he was a mercenary. He gave them all kinds of. He let them know what kind of war materials were being supplied by the Allies to the Russians. Couldn't be true. Couldn't be true. So the Germans were sure it was disinformation. He died. He became really quite famous after the war. I guess no one had ever had a career like this. And he died broke in 1970, so not much of a spy. I mentioned before the Aldrich Ames case, and there were a number, not only the Aldrich Ames, but the Walker spy ring. These were a father, a son, a brother, John Walker, Michael Walker, Arthur Walker, and a friend, Jerry Whitworth. And they were all passing. They got millions of dollars from the Russians. It was purely cash and carry. They supplied a lot of secrets about nuclear-powered submarines and so on, because the one of the sons served aboard a nuclear submarine. I think, can't remember which one it was, but when they were captured, the son said, "Oh, I did it to please my father." So they gave him 15 years, and I think the father was actually paroled. But now we come to the gem of the collection. Ashraf Marwan, the son-in-law of Nasser, who contacted the Israelis and offered to serve as a spy. This is what the Israelis said: the kind of thing that happens only once in 1,000 years. One of the most important spies the world has ever seen. Okay. This happened, as I say, he was a spy in return for money. He realized about $3 million from the Israelis. He may have also been spying for the Italians, they're not sure, also for money. He was known to the Israelis as the Angel. It was a good name for him. And a book has been published last year detailing the Angel. In 1965, the Angel, Ashraf Marwan, married the daughter of Nasser. His father was a senior officer in the army. The family was well off, and he had a BS in chemistry. Apparently, he was a chemist, had studied at a number of universities, and the marriage took place in 1966. In 1968, he asked to pursue his doctorate in London, asked to be sent to London. And Nasser agreed, fine, he could take studies for a doctorate in London. Well, apparently, London in the 60s was known as swinging London for a reason. And the Angel wanted to partake of the swinging life in London. Began running up big debts. Had an affair with the wife of a Kuwaiti sheikh. Nasser became furious. He wanted his daughter to divorce Marwan, but she refused, and Marwan was thereafter kept on a very short leash so far as money was concerned by Nasser. In 1969, he presented his thesis to the university, and apparently he had gone back to present his thesis, still on the short leash, so humiliated by his father-in-law that he called the Israeli embassy in London, and he said, I want to talk to the military attaché. Well, why do you want to talk to him? Because I want to work for you. How can that be? You know, this was, 2 years after the Six-Day War? Well, apparently, at this point, this information was turned over to Israeli intelligence, the Mossad, and they apparently decided to hire him. His terms were $100,000 for each meeting. Okay. They were afraid he might be a double agent, but they knew he loved money. He was a spendthrift. The first meeting was in London between Marwan and the head of the Mossad. Marwan told the Israeli that he was very disappointed by Egypt's defeat in the Six-Day War, and he wanted to work for the winner. He wanted to join the winner. Asked for $100,000 per talk, for every meeting. The head of the Mossad said, give me a sample of what you can deliver. And Marwan came back with the full text of all the meetings held between Nasser and the Soviet Union, in which Nasser demanded long-range bombers from the Russians in order to carry out raids in Israel. The chiefs of the Mossad were stunned. They couldn't believe it. How could this have, this plum had fallen into their laps? Total authenticity when they checked the documents he brought. A fabulous treasure was in their hands. And so it proved to be. He was their secret agent in London. A case officer was assigned to him. They met in a safe house. They rented an apartment for Angel. There were hidden listening devices, recording devices, and a special fund he could tap. He would initiate all meetings. He would call through a middleman. And lots of intelligence and military documents were exchanged in this way. In 1970, Nasser died, and Sadat succeeded him. Marwan was also very close to Sadat, was given a prime position on Sadat's personal staff, accompanied him in his trips through the world, helped him to smash a conspiracy against him, and became really one of his most trusted advisors. So the flow of information continued. He came with him to Washington, for example. He, all kinds of information and access, and all of it is flowing into the Mossad, into the Israeli government between 69 and 73. He prevented a missile attack on Israelis by Palestinian workers via Libya. He told them that the plane was taking off from Rome, which was true. All the information was absolutely correct. Well, the 1973, the Yom Kippur War, the Israelis are totally surprised, as you know. Why? On October the 5th, the war broke out on the 6th. On October the 5th, the head of the Mossad got a call from the angel, and he used a code expression. The code meant, the definition, whenever he used that word, chemicals was the word. When he used the word chemicals, that meant that war would break out immediately. They couldn't believe it. Nobody believed it. They were completely unprepared. The head of the Mossad went to London to interview him. This was the 5th. Are you sure? Absolutely. There is right now an encampment of Egyptian soldiers bordering the canal. They are going to be sent into action, as are the Syrians. He believed him. His name was Zahir, I think. Went back to Israel, spoke to Golda Meir and her Minister of Defense, as well as the head of Army Intelligence, General Zira. Oh no, he's a double agent. He's turned rogue. This can't be. We see no evidence of it. We know that the Egyptians are waiting at a delivery of Russian planes. They would not strike unless that delivery occurred. Absolutely not. We'll order a partial mobilization, not a full mobilization. The last message from Marwan was, war will break out today, this evening. And actually, the Egyptians moved the time up to noon. But that was the final message, war will break out today. Well, the head of military intelligence really had poo-pooed. He must have become a double agent. His name was General Eli Zira. The rest you know. The information was absolutely correct. He had lived up to his obligations. He had given them perfect information, except that he said it would come at noon, and there was a last-minute change of plans. He had said it would come at night, and the last-minute change moved it up to noon. The partial mobilization probably saved the Golan Heights for the Israelis because they were able to rush troops there. But as you know, the first days were chaotic and very, very costly in terms of Israeli lives. The whole cabinet decided against a preventive attack. They simply could not believe that the information was accurate, but it was. Well, this, of course, a subsequent campaign, he remained Sadat's right-hand man for many years. He was present at talks between Kissinger and King Hussein in America. He had access to the CIA. He lasted in that role for 25 years. When he needed medical attention, he went to the United States and the CIA took care of it. He had a second career in business, bid for Harrods. He tried to buy Harrods, and he bought a luxury apartment in London where apparently he spent most of his time. Had homes in Paris, had a very nice life. Now, a book came out in Israel about the Mossad in 2002 and referred to a mysterious spy known as the son-in-law. Oh, that provided some food for thought, but it seemed to point to him, vigorously denied. The head of military intelligence had been dismissed because he had given such bad advice on at the beginning of the Yom Kippur War. He now writes a book. Doesn't name Marwan, but he mentions that he still believes that the information they got was not authentic. Okay. A lot of people begin to wonder. 4 years later, he revises the book and he names him. In 2004, he said, the name of the angel is Ashran Marwan. He lives in London, probably gave his address. We depended on him for 10 years, and he gave us all kinds of information. He was an Israeli spy, and we paid him well. Well, 2 weeks later, what do you think happened? They found Marwan's body underneath his terrace in London, dead. And Scotland Yard investigated, but they never found out who killed him. Such was the fate. Cicero didn't end up too well, but a book has just come out, I think 2015, a couple of years ago, called The Angel, and it's about the exploit. This is maybe the most famous spy who spied for money. That's the overwhelming reason for spying. But there are other as well, there are other motives. For example, the motive of, I guess, ideological sympathy. And World War II, most of the successful spies of World War II are people who spied out of an ideological sympathy, mainly for the Russians, for the communists. So what we have is a vast number. We had Bletchley Park, electronic intelligence, but now we have the existence. You probably don't know the name Richard Sorge. James Bond is based on the life of Richard Sorge. He is the most influential spy maybe in history. I'm going to tell you all about him next week. In addition, you also don't know the name of Juan Pujol, do you? No. Next to maybe Montgomery and Eisenhower, let's say he was the most influential figure in the success of the D-Day landings. His name was not revealed publicly until 1984, when the 40th anniversary of the landings were celebrated. And he was then given his due, an obscure Spaniard, given his due by the king and the queen. But there are names that stud this, that are striking. No one knew what they did and the significance of what they did. It's only in recent years, especially with the opening of archives, that a lot of this has come true. But you'll hear all about that next week.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you.